Okay, let's get going with our last panel of the afternoon, Emergency in Europe, Russia and Refugees. It's going to be moderated by Mary Kissel. Let's bring out our panel, and Mary will introduce the panelists. Let's give them a warm welcome. Wow, you can't beat this intro music, can you? I mean, I'm energized. I don't know about the rest of you. My mic is on. Everyone can hear me? Okay, excellent. Well, again, thanks to the Steamboat Institute and the donors for putting together a really wonderful program, and thanks to all of you for staying to 3:45, which isn't necessarily a late hour, but after you've really absorbed all of the information that's been thrown at you today, it is a late hour, so thank you very much for staying, and we'll do our best to make it a lively panel. I'd like to introduce a very distinguished panel, and I'll start on my right. I put my own biographies together, so if I got something wrong, please let me know. Jillian Melcher, as you know, 2015-16 Tony Blankley Chair for Public Policy Fellow. She writes for National Review and is a fellow at the Franklin Center and the Independent Women's Forum. She has worked for a number of publications, august publications, a commentary, and I might add, the Wall Street Journal. She worked for the editorial page.
Hey, I've heard of it. Hey.
She's a graduate of Hillsdale and grew up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, so she's very familiar with this part of the country, and don't let looks deceive you. She is an intrepid reporter. She has been to some really incredible places around the world, and we'll have her talk about that today. To her right, Professor Jonathan Edelman. He's a full professor at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He received his PhD from Columbia University and has written or edited 12 books on Russia, China, and the Middle East, the specialty in security policy, foreign policy, and revolutions. He has been an honorary professor at both People's University and Peking University in China. He's taught at the University of Alabama and the University of Cincinnati, among many other universities. I can't name everything that he's done here, so I'll direct you to your program. One fact, and I think this is correct, he was the formal doctoral dissertation supervisor for this unknown woman named Condoleezza Rice.
Yes.
Wonderful. To his right, Peter Brooks, as you've seen earlier today, is with the Heritage Foundation as a senior fellow for national security affairs. He is serving his 4th term as a congressionally appointed member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He's been Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. He is an author, The Devil's Triangle, Terrorism, Weapons of Mass Destruction in Rogue States, a professional staff member with the House. He's served with the CIA in the Defense Department. He's worked for the defense and intelligence industries. He is a decorated, now retired Navy commander, so thank you for your service. I'd like to start in the middle with Professor Edelman, who very kindly sent me one of his op-eds, and I was struck by a paragraph. In thinking about Russia today, I was struggling. How do I start this panel? How do you account for the rise of Russia under the direction of Vladimir Putin? How did this man achieve so much? And Professor Edelman wrote this. He said, "The greatest surprise of all has been, yes, the sudden rebirth of Russian power under Putin. This is amazing given that Russia has withdrawn from Eastern Europe, lost half its population, lacks modern consumer, agricultural, and high-tech sectors, and suffered a 50% drop in the price of oil exports. Its economy is smaller of that of England, France, or Germany." So, Professor, I'd like you to start off with Vladimir Putin. How do we understand this man, his vision, how he sees the world? The floor is yours.
Great. Well, first of all, it's really delightful to be here today. And the news for Vladimir Putin, as bad as it was, as Mary said, is actually even worse. No, we're not talking about Republican Party politics. We're talking about Vladimir Putin. We'll leave the rest to Donald Trump. So what's powerful here is that that's only part of the horrors that he has to deal with. Let's look, for example, at demography, one of those boring subjects until you're on the wrong side of it. And what's powerful is that until last year, for the last 10 years, Russia was losing a net of 700,000 people a year. So that until they finally leveled off last year, the birth rate in Russia was less than 1.5 children per family. And even worse, millions of people migrating, going to Germany, going to the United States, going to Israel. And then the most amazing fact about Russia was the male life expectancy, which in the United States is fortunately kicking towards 80, but in Russia is 62. Now, if you also were to imbibe 2 billion liters of hard alcohol, you might get the idea. But what's fascinating is, back in the 1980s, I was very fortunate to be part of a Western group that met for an entire week in Telluride, Colorado. Another version of this, shall we say, but much smaller in those days. And they were from the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and they were the aides to Mikhail Gorbachev. And what was amazing about them was that, as much as we never expected it, they actually came to tell us the truth. And I asked one, how is the Russian economy going? And he said, well, except for vodka, we haven't had any improvement in 20 years. So you're talking about an economy, as we said, of what used to be $2 trillion, but now, as you just heard, the ruble dropping 50%, it's less than $1.5 trillion, and the American economy is $18 trillion. So we're talking about a country that doesn't even have 10% of the economy of the United States. But there's more. When we look overall at what people make in Russia these days, it's incredible. In the twin capitals, in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, the average person makes $700 a month. And in all those smaller towns that you can visit, all the way out to Vladivostok, the flight from Moscow to Vladivostok is only 5,600 miles. And when you go to Vladivostok, they're making $400 a month. And so you begin to see that this is a third world country, and not just in that way. It's also, how many people have been to Russia? Okay, how many of you got outside of Moscow, St. Petersburg, actually saw the countryside? Appalling, right? I mean, it wasn't much change from my grandparents fled Tsarist Russia in 1906 and talked about how incredibly backward it was. But if they saw these pictures today and were still alive, they would not be amazed. Because my grandfather used to talk about this, and he said, look, back when he left in 1906, he said, we were fortunate to have enough food to have for one meal. And when we went off to school elsewhere, we would have to have eating days. This is Russia. But not just Russia in the beginning of the 20th century. Out in the countryside, a lot of it is still that horrible. If you go to Moscow, the food you are eating is overwhelmingly not from Russia. 60% of the food in the twin capitals has to be imported. So forget the agricultural revolution. That hasn't reached Moscow yet, even though it reached the West in the 19th century. Then if you want to go and look at the consumer goods, look at the quality of consumer goods, apart from the ones, of course, that are nicely imported. And ask yourself a simple question. When you go into a Russian store, okay, and then you come back to the United States, so you know what Russians make, okay, and you go to shop, have you ever bought a sweater or pants or a jacket and turned it over and the label says, made in Russia? You haven't, for a very simple reason. They don't export. In fact, the people don't want it even within the country. So what you have is a severe problem, because if you don't have agricultural revolution, which, as we said, in some countries happened over 150 years ago, in China only in the last couple of decades, that means that you still are maintaining a huge group of people who are producing very little. If you don't have a consumer revolution, that means you're going to be dependent on whatever else you're going to be able to import from abroad. And if you don't have a demographic revolution, you're not going to be able to keep the numbers up, not just for the military, but for anything else. And then there's one other thing, the quality, and we've heard a lot about militaries here. So if we talk briefly about the Russian military, there's two things that are powerful to remember. One is to think about the Russian military in the war with the Chechens. from 1994 to 1996. This war went so badly in Grozny, which is one of the oil capitals, in this case in Chechnya, but in Grozny, that during the war, they brought in Russian troops who had overwhelming technical superiority. But one group of about 1,000 to 1,500 Chechen guerrillas drove an entire Russian division out of Grozny. How could that possibly happen? Unless you understand who was trading what for whom. They were busily trading their guns for vodka, for food, for other things. So when we're talking about Russia, we get to the amazing point, which is how can a country that has so much that is so incredibly backward, that has no immigration. When is the last time somebody went to a Russian consulate and said, I want to emigrate to Russia?
Schroeder?
But millions of people. You go to Israel, for example. There are 1,600,000 Russians living in Israel these days. And they do very well. That's the other dilemma that's really weird, which is that Russia has the second greatest number of technicians, engineers, and scientists in the world. And they're very good. My brother is an astronomer, went to Caltech, and he said after visiting Yalta and meeting with the Russian equivalents in astronomy, he said they were better than ours. And when they go abroad, when Russians go abroad, like in a strange country called the United States of America, when they come to America, they hold over 10,000 senior positions, including national laboratories, universities, research institutes, including a few obscure companies like Google and others, which have Russians even at the top. So how can you further explain that when they have such talent that Germany and Israel and the United States particularly have tremendously benefited? Israeli high-tech, for example, which is often touted, is actually Russian. 50% of the people working there were not born in Israel. They were born in Russia. In fact, if you go to Israel, the first thing they'll say is, we wish more Russians would come. What other country would wish that on themselves? So the bottom line is that when you look at all of this, and you look at the rest of the economic data, which is just incredibly pathetic, putting Russia basically in a third world status, you say, then how come Russia, which should be falling and falling and falling, on the other hand, is rising, rising, and rising in international politics? They don't seem to have any of the factors that you need. And so the second part of our talk is to try to understand what's going on here. First of all, you have to look at the leadership in Russia. It's very easy to make fun of Vladimir Putin. After all, he goes out and fights with tigers and flies jet planes, and you know, he's kind of soft and fuzzy and lovable. So the basic point about Vladimir Putin, though, is he's not stupid. You have to ask yourself a question. He was the fifth possible successor lined up as a prime minister, okay, by the failed regime of Boris Yeltsin. And yet, when he came to power, people, including myself, had to get out a book to try to find out who he was. We'd never even heard of him. And he's endured in a very difficult situation for the last 16 years and even triumphed. And then a name you don't hear much, Sergei Lavrov. He is the foreign minister. I was fortunate to have met him 3 times, twice in Moscow and once here in the United States. He is not warm, lovable, or cuddly, but his mind is like a computer. He is playing chess, which is, of course, the Russian national game, and while others are playing checkers, he's thinking 3, 4, 5 moves ahead, and he has help. One of my friends is a diplomat in the Russian Foreign Ministry, and I actually gave a course for a week in the Russian Foreign Ministry, and she told me things that were fascinating. One of them was that unlike our State Department, and I don't mean to malign our State Department, they do a reasonable job, but nothing compared to the Russians. She said, Tatiana told me when I first came there, what they said to me is, we are assigning you a country, and you can spend the rest of your life. We want you to be able to speak the language fluently so you can pass in that country. We want you to spend a lot of time in that country. We want you to even write books about that country. Tatiana's written 8 books on her particular country in the native language, so that when Sergei Lavrov wants to know what's going on in a country, he not only has that, as opposed to America where we rotate the people around and now there is a particular cone that you spend more time in, but no, a specific country for 30 or 40 years. So you're an absolute expert on it and you know everything that's going on. So the first thing is you have smart leadership. Leadership that is malevolent, leadership that we would view as perhaps evil in many ways, and all that is true. But as we heard earlier on the stage, unfortunately, some of the smartest people in the world are the most malevolent and evil people. We just have to live with that. And so that's number one. And they're looking at the long term. Every administration comes to power and is thinking 4 years, 8 years, and then I'm out of here. Here, Vladimir Putin came to power because he wanted kind of what is considered the ultimate aphrodisiac in the world, and that is to die in power. Now, Russians have achieved that. Lenin did that in 1924, you remember? Stalin succeeded and died in 1953. And Leonid Brezhnev, despite having been declared almost dead, coming back from the Central Asia in the late 1970s, actually did manage to die in office. But apart from the negative side that we can see from that, there is one positive. You're looking at the long term. You're not out for 90-day wonders. You're trying to think several years down the line, what are the things that I'm going to be able to do? Secondly, Russia is not in conventional weapons, certainly not overall in how well they fight on the field of battle, but in terms of thermonuclear weapons, in terms of weapons similar to the United States for a thermonuclear war, they still have 1,900 of them. Aging, yes, but nevertheless it keeps them at a certain level compared to all the other countries like Pakistan that have 80 to 100 and are trying to get 200 more bombs and so forth. Russia is a first-class power, and it's one of the top countries that exports weapons to anybody. There is no consideration. Think about the Middle East. In the Middle East, one of the key things that you need are weapons and some training in it. So what happened when the president was favoring, you remember, Mohamed Morsi instead of the person who became the leader, the head of the Egyptian military, al-Sisi. The Russians, as soon as the Muslim Brotherhood was overthrown, rushed in and offered, while the Americans were dithering, a deal, $2.1 billion in weapons today. And the Egyptians took it. Now, think about that. If you know anything about Egyptian history, you know that was amazing because the Egyptians got kicked out twice. I mean, the Russians got kicked out of Egypt in 1972, right before the 73 war, and then finally in 1977, as the Egyptians went over completely into the American camp. So this is something that hadn't happened in 40 years. And then when the president said, well, we're going to delay on Apache helicopters, the response to the Kremlin was, right now, we will give you the best helicopters that we have, and we will deliver it to you in the next couple months on favorable terms. So guess what they did? They bought the helicopters. So, and the same thing with nuclear reactors. Take Jordan. No one in the Middle East and the Arab world is more pro-American than King Abdullah II. After all, where did he go to college? Sandhurst. And how good was his Arabic? So bad that when his father, King Hussein, decided that he was going to switch, when I was in Israel, we used to watch Jordanian television, and you know, his brother was really pretty hopeless. And so they wanted to change to Abdullah II. He actually had to get a tutor to learn classical Arabic. He was speaking English better than he was Arabic. So we need to keep this in mind, that how have they been able to do that? And three other things quickly, because we have limited time. One of them is that, and many people ignore this, Russia has a series of good relationships, some of which go back even over 100 years. Take the French. In the 19th century, Russian aristocrats could speak French before they could speak Russian. They couldn't even speak to the peasants, but they could speak to the French nobility. That deal continued through World War I, when Tsarist Russia was there for the French. In World War II, when who helped, of course, the Americans liberated France, but who was responsible for destroying, according to the German historians after the war, 90% of the soldiers in the Third Reich up to June 1944, the Soviet Red Army. So this relationship is strong, and you saw it play out again with François Hollande, making a deal with them. And the same thing if we were in Hungary. Forget the fact the Russians invaded Hungary in 1849 and in 1956. Now we have Viktor Orban from the Fidesz party who says his model is Russia. And we can go through a series of other countries. Germany, where it's the reverse, because Germans killed 27 million Russians in World War II, the Germans are not going to go beyond just some slight sanctions. So the Russians can play all of that, and that is very important. And finally, as we look at this, we can also see that the Russians have a capability because of the feeling, and that's our final point. Our final point is the biggest reason is because of the United States. It's because the United States gave Russia the opening by starting to withdraw and favor even elements like the Islamic Republic of Iran, like the Muslim Brotherhood and others, not totally, but enough that they scared the daylights out of Saudi Arabia, who was negotiating for 32 nuclear reactors from Russia. King Abdullah II of Jordan, 2 nuclear reactors coming from Russia. With the Russian experience you all remember from 35 years ago with nuclear reactors, you'd wonder why anybody would want theirs. But the fact is that they want them. So where are we? Where we are is a situation where the Russians are very clever in how they're playing the game. They are sending a powerful message. We are no longer communist. We are conservative realists. If you are in power, like al-Sisi in Egypt, and it's difficult, or Bashar Assad in Syria, we will give you weapons, we will give you intelligence information, and here's the very last point. You just saw the other day, they're winning in Syria. Did you see that? 5,700 airstrikes by the Russian Air Force, and the result is that now Aleppo, not just part of it, but all of it may be taken by Syrian forces who are so demoralized that they were often surrendering or running away. And now Aleppo, the biggest city in Syria, is on the verge of going over to Bashar Assad. What's the message then for other forces in the Middle East and elsewhere? Who can you rely on? They may be bastards, but there are bastards, is what they're saying. And we're going to live with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Other panelists, you are welcome to get up and walk around. Like the professor, I'm happy if you stay in your seats. As my great aunt Hortense used to tell me, never stand if you can sit, never sit if you can lie down. But I leave the choice to you. So that was an incredible tour de force, again, of where Russia is. So what I understood is Putin starts from an incredibly weak hand, economically, demographically, yet they retain an enormous amount of force with their nuclear program, and they may have allies that we don't appreciate.
Right.
So, Peter, given what you've just heard then, what is Putin's ultimate goal? Is it to break up NATO? Is it to extend the power to the Mediterranean? Is it to form an alliance with Iran? How do you understand where he wants to go?
One of the things I think that can inform our thinking about Vladimir Putin was that in 2005, in his sort of State of the Union address, when he speaks to the Duma, he said, I think I'm quoting this pretty close here, he said that the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, that didn't make my list, but it obviously made his list. And I think it gives you some idea of the mindset of Vladimir Putin, the once and future president, and the Kremlin. Putin, as a former KGB officer, wasn't very happy with how the Cold War ended. And they feel that it's upon him to return Russia to its prior glory. And I think just like nature, international politics also abhors a vacuum. And I think the United States and others have provided those vacuums that the Russians are willing to fill.
So it's not a grand plan. You see him as a KGB agent who sees an opening and
I think it's
goes
tactical, but of course the drivers. I don't know if the professor will agree with me. There's a lot of drivers here. You can't ignore history, especially when you talk about Crimea. You talk about Ukraine. There's certain motivations that the Russians have. I mean, Russia had been a major competitor of the other major powers in Europe and around the world during the Cold War. So these are the sort of things that inform their thinking. And so I think that yes, they see NATO as a threat. They've said that in their newest national security strategy. Interestingly to me, they have tremendous influence operations going on in Europe.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they own non-governmental organizations. They own some of the press. I mean, this is Cold War stuff. I mean, this is spy versus spy stuff. And I was kind of shocked by this because I had a recent meeting with some Europeans who shall go unnamed here, but well-informed people, thoughtful people, who said at the meeting we had, and they said, how do you deal with Russian propaganda? I was like, what? I said, we ignore it. Because I don't think anybody's buying into what Russian television or RT or any of their other news organizations is selling. But in Europe, it's a huge issue, and they're very worried about it. I mean, the Russian media outreach has the same, I've heard this, I don't know if this is true, it's not my own research, but has the same size budget as the BBC. They own non-governmental organizations which they control. So yeah, they are trying to break up NATO. You have to understand, when Russia looks at NATO, they see a threat. They see the Cold War. They think that NATO would actually invade Russia, and I don't think anybody's thinking about that at all. And this is part of their history. It's just like Ukraine. When they look at Ukraine, they say, this is where Mother Russia was born, Kiev and Rus. And they also remember that German armies came across Ukraine. Part of Napoleon's armies, I think, came across Belarus and Ukraine. They believe in buffer states, so they need this. And I think that, yeah, they absolutely want to. I do disagree with a lot of my colleagues. I don't believe that Russia is going to go after the Baltics, because I don't think he wants a fight with NATO. I think he's a realist about the disparity in the military strength of the West and Russia. Not to say that if there were an opportunity he wouldn't do something, but I don't think he's going to force that. Ukraine is another issue. Ukraine is not in NATO. It's not part of that. There is no defense requirement for the NATO or the West to defend Ukraine. So that's a different kettle of fish. So yes, and I think in the Middle East he sees the United States as cautious. That's probably retrenching, withdrawing, retreating, whatever you want, and they're going to go right into that vacuum. Syria has been Russia's window into the Middle East and influence for many, many years. So that's why they're there. And the same thing as the professor talked about, the arms sales, which provides influence. They're doing that all over the place. They're with China in the Pacific. Major exercises in the Arctics. The Russians have left the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. They're violating the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. I mean, this is a country that is saying, if there's no consequences to our actions in promoting and advancing Russian interests, we're going to do it. And I think that's where we're at. So I don't think there's an end game yet, but I think that they're definitely they're probing. They're probing where they can get away. Like, what do we do about Crimea?
Well, can I also chip in?
Okay, I'll stop.
I think part of the dynamic here is power for the sake of power. And if I were going to write a book of rules for a smart dictator, I think we see this in China, we see this with Putin, that if things aren't going well on the home front, as you very well explained, one way to gun up nationalism, one way to get domestic support is by being aggressive to your neighbors and doing it well. We see that, with China's corruption scandals in 2012, Taylor and I were in Beijing, and it was really interesting watching tensions in the South China Sea racket up, and then all of a sudden Uniqlo, the Chinese or Japanese clothing store, has to shut down for a couple days because suddenly Chinese aren't paying attention to what's going on domestically. They're worried about the foreign threat. And I think to some extent Putin's playing that same game, that he wants to consolidate power. And sometimes his neighbors are just unfortunate pawns.
Well, we titled, we had a debate about the title of this panel, but we ended on Emergency in Europe, Russia, and Refugees, because we also wanted to talk not just about how Putin sees NATO, sees Europe, but about the impact of what he's doing on the ground. Jillian, can you speak? Because when we talk about refugees, we're really talking, we talk mostly about Syria. We don't think about how Russia connects in. Can you connect those dots and talk about your reporting and what you've seen on the ground?
Sure. And I'll say, I'm kind of surprised that I've done so much reporting in Europe in the past year or so, because I like countries in chaos. I like going to places that are not doing well, and I never thought that that would lead me to Europe, but it has, and it's really unfortunate. So I want to give you kind of a personal perspective, and I think that's important because, if we look at important events within the last decade, the Arab Spring, that was kicked off by a small businessman with a cart and a petty bureaucrat. That shaped politics in that region as much as the US military and as much as our withdrawal. So I think sometimes understanding the people, understanding the individual stories is a really important aspect that gets overlooked. So when I'm looking at the refugee crisis, a couple statistics come to mind that I think will paint a picture for you. This is a much more diverse group of people coming into Europe than people give it credit for. We talk a lot about the Syrians and the Afghanistans. Well, if we break down Syrians just in particular, a lot of Muslims, but 1 in 10 Syrians are Christians. That's a significant population. Then in addition to that, we have a lot of people coming in. I saw Nigerians on the route. I saw Somalians. I see people coming into Europe thinking that this is their opportunity to get in and get a free pass. In fact, I had one guy who lied to me about being Syrian. Later found out through an Iraqi friend who unlikely recognized him on my Instagram page that he was Iraqi. He'd been lying about being a Syrian, probably to get into Germany. So within this refugee population, really diverse. I'm going to tell a couple quick stories to give you the perspective, and I think why Europe is so conflicted about this. So on one side, we said the 2% statistic of 2% of them are terrorists. We have an enormous problem. And I did see some evidence of very troubling behavior there. I think one of them was, I did this interview with this group of young men. They had a young woman in their presence. We have this very cordial interview. They break out their phone. They're describing the sea crossing. And then a young man in my group gets up, goes to shake the guy's hands, goes to the woman, reaches out without thinking to shake her hand, and the whole group freezes. This woman looks petrified. And this tension is just hanging in the air. And it was so unusual because it was like I had in front of me the cultural clash, what this woman was going to have to deal with to assimilate to Europe. That enormous cultural boundary, just in the shake of a hand. And I heard stories that were worse than that. One of the volunteers I spoke to had been on the border. It was pouring rain during my trip. And this young woman had slipped in the mud. So a male volunteer rushes over to help her up. And what I heard is that a guy, probably her husband, came at this volunteer with a knife because he was going to touch the woman. So we've certainly got that dynamic there. I don't want to downplay the cultural dynamic because it is extremely troubling. On the flip side, I think what a lot of Europeans are seeing is people who are extraordinarily vulnerable and who want the promise of the West. And I think the United States should keep that in mind too, because our withdrawal put many of these people at risk. I remember talking to one Iraqi mother. We were on the Serbian border getting ready to cross over to Croatia. The sun had come out for the first time in days. And we were talking about the day that she left outside of Mosul. And as she was speaking, her voice grew really thick with tears. And what had happened was she was running from the Islamic State. She had her kids in tow. She had her 1-year-old son. He was just beginning to walk. And the Islamic State was shooting into the crowd. And a stray bullet hit her son in the head, killed him. She had to keep running. And hearing her talk about how this was her hope for the future, hearing her talk about what it meant for her as a mother to have a future in the West, to know that her children could get an education, I think that's a dynamic that's pulling on the heartstrings of Europe, properly so. It's a tension, though, between compassion, humanitarianism, and also national security, and those very real cultural concerns.
Peter, I want to make this link explicit. Should we blame Putin for the refugee crisis and emergency in Europe that she's just described? Would Assad be in power without Putin's support?
It's interesting. It's an interesting thought. I don't know if I can make a direct correlation between the two, but the Russians have been supporting militarily the Assad regime for some time. Now, I can't say Putin's behind the barrel bombs or the air campaign or anything along those lines, but they are a supporter of the Assad regime. A lot of the people who have left Syria have left because of the regime, but a lot of them have left because of the Islamic State. And now we have tremendous difficulties because Russia, I think the Islamic State problem is more difficult now because Russia is there. That might sound simplistic, but I think that's the case because when as the professor pointed out, I think the Russians have made more strikes in 3 months than we have in 15.
Right.
Is that right?
Right.
Strikes. Now, the Russians are not very gentle, okay? They're not so concerned about collateral damage in terms of that. And they've also been going after groups that we've been supporting that are fighting the regime. The problem is we don't have a Syria policy. That's another separate thing. But I think, yeah, I mean, I can't say that these refugees are directly the responsibility of Russia. Russia has upped its involvement and may up its involvement more, potentially.
Especially if the United States doesn't get involved.
Right, yeah. And
they will.
Yeah, but I don't know if I can say that that's the case. I mean, it's a terrible place. The other thing I think is very important to point out, and I'm not a legal scholar or a lawyer, but refugees, when in the movement of them, they're going to have to go through. I wish you'd talk about this a little bit. A refugee is somebody who's persecuted by you under U.S. law. Mm-hmm. It's not somebody who's just leaving a bad situation, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how are the Europeans going to be?
Well, it gets very
that?
legally and practically complicated, I think, because, okay, so you can make the argument that you want the Arab countries to take them in. You want fellow Muslim countries to take them in. Well, we're seeing that happen. It's overwhelming Turkey. It's overwhelming northern Iraq, Kurdistan. I've literally met with city officials that have said, we don't have enough resources. This is breaking our hearts. We remember ourselves what it was like to be refugees. We're emptying out our own pockets to help these people, and still more and more are coming in. So you've got that, completely overwhelming. So then they go into Europe, but they go to Italy first, Greece first. Economic basket cases. If they register there under European law, that's where they're supposed to stay until they get an assignment. Really stresses those economies. I think that's a huge part of Europe's dis-ease with this. Then in addition to that, Germany had made this policy, you're supposed to be in the first place that you register, you're supposed to wait there. Germany decided to waive that for Syrians, said basically, come here, we'll treat you specially, we'll give you all kinds of benefits, we'll put you up in housing, language programs, you'll get childcare until we make a determination on your asylum status. Well, the countries in between, Hungary in particular, were very vocal about, wait a second, they can't get to Germany without coming through us. And they're viewing the threat of terrorism, they're viewing what happened in Paris, they're viewing the fact that some of these people passing through are very aggressive. And I think there's a lot of discomfort with that. It's threatening the European Union, certainly. But I think there is really not an ideal solution other than restoring peace in the Middle East. This is the consequence of the U.S. vacuum. It has a chain reaction through Europe.
Professor, do you concur? Does the U.S. have to get involved?
I think it's going to, and it raises yet another issue, which we haven't really discussed much, which is the general view of the Europeans towards Russia. Because what's happened, as we all know, is that in a sense this has really weakened the United States, because to the extent that the French are in a minor way involved, but overwhelmingly we see the rise of far-right parties, and we see Marine Le Pen, for example, getting 29% of the vote. And so the migrants indirectly are having an effect on the view towards Russia, because it has become the #1 issue that they have to deal with, and it's one that even Angela Merkel, with her generosity, then saw a decline in her support as more radical elements. So from the Russian point of view, this is good, because that means that Europe is not going to be able to react. Now, we're not so much talking about Estonia here, but more in order to be able to do anything to constrain them, such as in Syria, because they've got problem at home rather than going into the Middle East. So Putin would love this.
Isn't it an upside-down world where Eastern Europe is begging for the United States to come in and help, and Western Europe is looking toward Russia? It's really extraordinary. Professor, just to build on your comments earlier, though, one of the last speakers said that Putin needed an $80 oil price to break even.
It's 120.
Is it 120?
That's a figure I've always heard.
Will this problem resolve itself? Can Russia continue? How long can he sustain this strategy?
Not for too many years, but the bottom line is, as you know, the price of oil has been very volatile. Obviously, it may go down a little more with Iranian oil coming on the market, but what's important is that Russia has thought about this. And just like Saudi Arabia, which had over $700 billion in reserve, they had about $450 billion. Now, this year alone, they may be using up $70 billion to somewhere between $50 and $100 billion, depending on where the oil price goes. So the question is, does this become a long-term problem, or is this more of that tremendous oscillation of oil prices that have been anywhere from a few years ago, $137 or $147 a barrel, down to $23 a barrel? So, and the other thing is, and you mentioned this, and I think that was important, that Putin has a ready explanation for why maybe we have to suffer. In other words, 5 to 10% decline in the GNP, but it's not my fault. I'm busy, and it's exactly what Peter, was saying, was that I am regaining Russia. And these things are really important. Let me just give one example. For example, we talked here about Crimea. To the average American, what does Crimea mean? Well, but to the average Russian, it means Catherine the Great making a naval port out of this in the late 18th century. And it means going back to 988, where we talked about Vladimir the Great in Kiev and Rus, which you referred to. this is another issue altogether, whether Ukraine really is Russian or not. But nevertheless, by regaining this from where Vladimir the Great was baptized as a Christian and became basically Russian Orthodox, that the whole history is in places that I am taking back, plus the majority of people are Russian speakers. So why are they complaining? They've got a nice phrase for it. This is just national self-determination.
Peter, it is extraordinary how popular Putin
Well, don't overlook
remains.
Only 85% popularity.
But it's in a country that has an open internet, that has access to information, unlike China,
Right.
where they actually put up barriers. How is this possible?
I hope I don't offend, but I think it's part of Russian culture. They admire strength. There's a word called mujik, you know, that's kind of a rough, tough individual. They like strong leadership, and I think that's one of the reasons. Plus, he can ride tigers.
Right, absolutely.
So I mean, I think if I think I saw him on a white a white shark, you know, a sort of thing, a great white shark one time. But they admire this, and I think you can't underestimate whether you're talking about China. We talked about the social contract this morning between the Chinese people and the Chinese leadership. I will make you proud of China. Nationalism is a very powerful force. It's also very dangerous too, sometimes internally and sometimes externally. And
But
I
it's
think
popular.
It's popular,
At
and
home.
I think it works in Moscow. It works in Russia.
Oh, one final quick point.
Please.
The popularity is most out in the smaller cities in the countryside. It's less among the more sophisticated people in Moscow and St. Petersburg. There's a big difference there.
Julian, we've seen borders closing among the European Union countries, and a real crisis in Germany because of these refugees that you spoke of, and a great divide emerging in the society over what to do. Emergency in Europe, the title of our panel. How bad is it going to get? The professor spoke of right-wing parties emerging. Are we looking at not just a fortress Europe, but a fortress of individual nations and perhaps the breakup of the European Union? Or is that too sensational?
What about Cologne? What happened in Cologne too? I mean,
Right.
that's a huge. I think that's a huge thing, isn't it?
So I think with what happened in Germany on New Year's, there were hundreds of rapes reported, refugees suspected for the majority of them. That's something that cuts German women to the core. That's devastating to them. And I think those security concerns, not even am I going to be subject to a terrorism attack, but am I going to be sexually safe walking out on the streets on a holiday? That's a big question that Germany is having to answer right now. And that's Germany. That's Germany that was more open to refugees than anywhere else in Europe. I think other places, Hungary notably, have been a bit more hesitant, probably a little bit wiser in their approach to it. But I do think, I was surprised going around talking to people saying, is this the end of the European Union? And
Is it?
they were saying yes, because we've got a breakdown of open borders. At one point, Hungary ran out of barbed wire because it's trying to shutter its fences. Germany is fighting about whether to sell it because is that inhumane? You've got Austria throwing up fences. So you've got passport checks at places where we have not had passport checks in years. That's just the open border perspective of it. You've got the security concerns. If we're not safer, why are we the European Union? You've got the economic stresses. We've got this many people coming in. If they're in Greece, if they're in Italy, if they come here and strain our social system, what are we going to do about that? We've got our own pensioners. That's the economic component. And then under that, we have the cultural component. I think Europe is having to reckon right now with whether or not it will embrace its Judeo-Christian heritage, or whether it's going to embrace this multiculturalism that may mean, yes, we're more accepting, but the trade-off is you can't wear a long skirt and you can't walk around outside at night feeling safe. These are all things that are huge questions for the European Union, causing enormous splinters. We're seeing a complete collapse of rule of law. I think the refugees have really illustrated that. There were pre-existing agreements with how you will handle a population flow like this. That's being completely disregarded. And then intensifying all this is we've had more than 1 million people come in the last year, and there's no end in sight. Things in the Middle East are not getting better. I think it's a real big concern, and it is quite possible that the EU could go under.
Professor, do you concur?
Yes, and I think there's something else, which is all of this is on top of what already was very difficult. Two other things. One was, for example, the Scottish independence movement in England, which has a not too bad chance of ultimately passing, and Catalonia in Spain, and the fact that Europe is growing at about 1 to 1.5% a year, And there's this whole group of countries in Europe, the more recent acquisitions from the old Eastern Europe, who are hot, for example, Bulgaria and Romania, where there's a tremendous amount of corruption. So in other words, all of this is just making everything, there was already to the point that England is going to have a referendum on whether it even wants to be in it next year. But so in other words, this is adding on, this is really lighting the fire, where already it was smoldering very considerable, whether Europe was even going to be one.
And so, Peter, all to the benefit of Russia.
Oh, I think so. The other thing that we haven't touched upon with Russia and Europe is the fact that Europe is still very energy dependent.
Right.
Natural gas, right?
But we're now exporting to Europe. The first tanker arrived this week.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to make a difference. And the Russians are willing to shut that natural gas off, as we know. The Ukrainians have.
In the middle of the winter.
In the middle of the winter. It makes a very strong impact. It makes a very strong statement. There's also the security side. The Russians have a very capable military still, and they've had exercises. I mentioned they've left the conventional forces in Europe treaty. They withdrew unilaterally from this. And what this did was a confidence and security building measures would allow us to say, like, hey, we're going to have a big exercise. We're just telling you it's not an invasion. Well, the Russians got out of it, and then last year they had a couple of exercises, no notice, snap exercises, where they mobilized 100,000 troops. You know, and if you're Polish or you live in the Baltic states, you sit up and pay attention. NATO is sending fighter jets on a regular basis to intercept Russian bombers and reconnaissance aircraft that are violating NATO airspace. Even countries that are not, partners of NATO or friends of NATO, such as Sweden, have seen their waters violated by Russian submarines. So you've got the energy issue here, right? Not that there's a lot of trade going on, as the professor pointed out, but you've also got the security aspect. The Russians have a big stick that they're waving around.
So they've got a lot of leverage.
And there's one more thing. We've seen for the first time far-right parties saying nice things about Russia because it's authoritarian and it's anti-American. So if Marine Le Pen is here, first of all, she's dropped the anti-Semitism, and now she's moving on to sometimes saying, Russia's not so bad because, after all, it's just the right-wing version of a leftist party.
That is such an important point. Jillian, Germany is the largest economy in Europe. It is the de facto leader of Europe. Some of you may disagree. We can do that in the Q&A. But if the Germans can't figure this out and can't set a direction for Europe and push back on the trend that the professor just described with the far right-wing parties, who will? Britain?
That's a great question and one I don't have a good answer to. I mean, I think we're seeing that to some extent with our own domestic debate about immigration. I mean, that's something that's been pushed into this election cycle as a litmus test, and we're not able to talk about it in the same way we used to. We used to talk about it, in terms of just economic things. We were really lucky. On our border, we had people that didn't share language but shared Judeo-Christian culture. It wasn't that much of a learning curve for them to assimilate. I think Europe is having a far-right reaction to a very real assimilation problem. And I think it's unfortunate that we're beginning to pick that up as well.
Let me do some logic jujitsu here, in the fact that Russia is also, you talk about playing chess and thinking moves ahead. Russia, they're claiming it, they're not actually doing it, but they're claiming they're in Syria to fight the Islamic State, and they have a reason to do so since it brought down that Russian airliner over the Sinai, right? But the fact of the matter is that puts Europe, which is in the crosshairs of the Islamic State, and the United States in a tough position on sanctions over Ukraine and Crimea. So if we're working with
especially when the Russians are being effective,
right?
More effective than the Americans. That's really a problem.
I'm not sure all of they're targeting.
No, they're killing a lot of innocent people.
And regime opponents too. That's their main focus.
But that's also terrorism.
Right.
They're terrorists.
Right. So it puts you in a tough position, and you can see, Comrade Boris saying to me, why would you want to sanction us? We're fighting with you in Syria.
We've got the same
This
enemies.
is part of what's going on there. And Europe is thinking about that too, after Paris and all the plots that quickly pass from our view that we forget about. I mean, we've had 80 plots here in the United States since 9/11. I can't name but a few of them off the top of my head because most of them failed. The ones that came to fruition I can remember, but all the ones that failed. So there's there's stuff going on in Europe that they're under significant threat, and so Russia's helping them, but how can you sanction Moscow when they're helping you in Syria with the Islamic State? So it gets very complicated.
And I will say that one of the things that struck me, I'd never understood this before, like I understood it this fall when I was there, is that when we are weak, when we don't have strong defense, when we're incompetent in our foreign policy, that hinders our ability to show compassion and to behave in a humanitarian way. You can't do that safely without being strong. And I think that's something that Europe's very tragically giving up.
I'm aware of the time. This is an on-time operation. And I want to open up the floor to Q&A. So if you have a question, which I know many of you do, please raise your hand and we will get a mic to you. And I'd ask you to, questions only, not statements. Thank you.
Yeah.
Gentlemen.
Jim
right
Eckersley, Windsor, Colorado. I'm always a big fan of watching which direction the refugees run. How many of them are running to Russia?
0.
Yeah.
That was an easy question. Thank you for kicking it off with an easy question. We've got the gentleman in the front here.
I'm not sure, earlier you were talking about the price of oil and $100 and something Russia needs, whatever it is. And is that because their costs are so high to extract oil, or is it more social?
No, they're debt.
Engineering, okay.
I wouldn't quote me on the $120 barrel of oil. That may be a bit antiquated now, but I know at one time it was $120 for them to pay their debts. They have debts, and that's what they need to keep the economy afloat. Because they don't. I mean, I think John McCain kind of had it right. He said, Russia is a gas station masking as a country. And that's what they do. I mean, Russia has missed the great opportunity at the end of the Cold War to embrace free markets and develop it. I mean, as the professor pointed out, Russia had tremendous scientists, knowledge of hard science. They had tremendous military technology, which was based on hard sciences. And they passed up on that, and there was a tremendous brain drain of people, qualified people
We're
who
happy
left.
to have come here.
Well, right, computers. I mean, we talk about China and cyber warfare. The Russians, the ones who have stayed behind, Russia is no slacker on cyber, believe me. And so this is something that, this is a country that missed an opportunity, very highly educated. The Russians used to say they were the most well-read people in the world because they had nothing else but books during the Soviet Union, right, and vodka. But they used to say they were the most well-read people in the world, and I don't doubt that that was the case, especially literature and culture was so important to the Russian intelligentsia and regular folks as well. So they missed an opportunity to embrace free markets and do things. So now it's just oil and gas, really, and weapons.
They really did miss an opportunity because 80%, you maybe wonder what these scientists, technicians, and engineers were doing. Over 80 to 85% were working for the military.
Yeah, sure.
And in the United States, the figure is way under 20, maybe even 10. So that's a huge difference between the two.
Next question. Actually, this gentleman in the front had one. He's got
Well, Mr. Beaupre's
Where are we?
standing.
I can't
so
see with the
I'll-
light. There we are.
He's following the rules.
Thank you. My apologies for my third bite at the question apple today, but I can't resist. Reagan, in part, hastened the end of the Cold War by understanding that their economy couldn't keep up with our economy in modernizing and strengthening our military. How does Putin, given, Doctor, what you explained about the sad state of affairs of their economy, and the rest of you have chimed in as well, how does he afford the modernization that I read about that's going on with his military and the aggression of his military and wherever this path takes him? How can he afford it long term?
Well,
Professor?
yeah, well, he's spending $80 billion a year. And so he understands something as a former KGB guy very well, that if he wants to stay in power, he has to have the support of the Russian military. In fact, it's similar to the Chinese military, why they support Xi Jinping, because they're getting $150 billion a year. Yeah. Plus, it gives them that possibility to nibble away at the old Russian empire that's outside. So that helps give them the 85%. So if he were here, he'd say, they're not used to eating all that much or buying that many things, but they want the country to be strong. And that's something Peter pointed out. It's very powerful with Russians, this feeling, especially because they don't have a lot of the things that people just assume they have in the United States or in the West.
And that's one of the reasons they're spending so much time on their nuclear modernization programs. The interesting thing, we didn't get to talk about it, but New START, remember the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty that President Obama brought in 2010? Well, the reduction only applied to us. the R and that only applied to us. Russia could actually increase their number of launch platforms and warheads under the treaty. We were the ones that were reducing ours, but that's the president's no nuke. He thinks he's the Pied Piper of non-proliferation, you know, and that if he draws down, everybody will follow him. He hasn't talked to people like North Korea and others about this sort of thing. But no, this is the reason they're focusing on the nuclear program and modernizing it. They've put a number of new ICBMs into play, including sea-launched ballistic missiles, because that's a big punch. And so their conventional forces are weaker, and they keep talking about big military buildups, but then all of a sudden oil prices drop, and the $700 billion military buildup they talk about has to be kind of put on hold. So they're doing what they can, and they're also doing it pretty much on the cheap. I don't know, where they got 2 squadrons of fighters in Syria and a couple of thousand guys on the ground. And just think about the impact it's having geopolitically in the region and beyond. So they're doing pretty well with just a limited amount of stuff that they're employing, I think.
And as long as he's got the secret police and the military strongly behind him, he can sleep at night.
And I want to make the point where while we're on the topic of Russian nuclear weapons and the Obama administration, I think one thing that doesn't get enough attention is that Ukraine had nuclear weapons and gave them up.
Right.
And it did so under the promise that the United States, Britain, and Russia would protect its frontier, protect its territory. That has not happened. Territory has been annexed. Crimea has been eaten up. People are having this, their families are split. They're suddenly finding themselves in 2 countries away from their parents. And we just haven't done anything about it. I think many other countries, many of our allies are looking at this and saying, you know, what incentive do we have to denuclearize? What incentive do we have not to pursue this? We're looking at what's happening to the Ukrainians, and we see that the U.S. is not keep following through on its promises. I think that has been catastrophic for the global nuclear setup.
But isn't that the great irony that the president who proclaimed that non-proliferation was one of his biggest goals, maybe the president who enabled the greatest nuclearization that we have seen in an era? Okay.
This is Charles Reardon, and I had a question for Dr. Adelman.
Sorry, sir, where are you? You're in the back. Yes, sir.
Dr. Adelman, how are things going in Chechnya these days? You don't hear much about it. How are the Russians dealing with Chechnya?
Not badly, because they've been exported. About 7,500, by one Russian estimate, of Muslims who were busily fighting them are now in the Middle East carrying on terrorist activities. So they've become an export item.
Yeah, the Islamic State.
I'm not trying to be humorous. I mean, that's really the way the Russians would look at it.
Russia
We
still
got rid of
faces
them.
an insurgency there, though,
Right.
by Al-Qaeda and Islamic State organizations, but they haven't had much problem since before the Olympics, right?
Right,
When the
right.
Volgograd attack
So
at the
it's
train
worked for
station.
them to encourage them.
Yeah, well, they
to
leveled
go.
Grozny. They play tough, and they
Right.
leveled Grozny when they had the earlier insurgency there, and the Russians certainly understand strength.
Right.
The gentleman here in the front.
So my question is for Peter, perhaps, but I think my last sleepless night was the day that I watched Turkey shoot down the Russian plane, right? And so my question is, what can we extrapolate from Putin's thought process, right, by his action or non-reaction, depending on that? Because I mean, that for me was kind of my first, like here we go, right? I mean, this could be it, but it seemed like there was a fairly reserved response to that. So in terms of what that can tell us to that chess game.
Yeah, I think I agree. It was very reserved, and I don't think the Russians did much at all, except for some complaining about it. I don't know exactly where the aircraft was. If it was in Turkish airspace, I really couldn't understand why the Turks, if it was in their airspace for 10 seconds, couldn't have done something else as opposed to what they did. And I think it probably put some cracks in the possibility of cooperation with. Against the Islamic State. I don't know. What do you think, Professor?
Right. Well, I think 2 things. One is that, as you know, the conflict between Russia and Turkey is very old. If you go back several centuries, they fought a dozen wars with the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So while Putin was cautious, which I think shows he's capable of it, I think he, at home, whipped up anti-Turkish sentiment, which is we need strong Russian nationalism to oppose that. So I think that was very powerful.
The other thing is that if geography is destiny, and as we've said many times, you just can't pick up and move away. The Russians, part of their reason for taking Crimea was their oldest naval ports at Sevastopol. and it's important for them. And they have to go through the Turkish Straits on their way to the Mediterranean, including their naval base at Tartus, Syria. So they think about this. This is a neighbor across the Black Sea there, and Turkey is an increasingly influential country in that part of the world. I mean, they're one of the few countries that survived the global economic downturn. Now, some of the trends in Turkey we could discuss separately in that case, but the Russians understand that the Turks are right across the Black Sea from them, and that Turkey isn't going away, and I don't think Russia's going to give up Crimea either. So I think it's important to them geopolitically.
More questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Question, please.
Dr. Brooks, can you tell me, in the deliberations that go on into making a decision about whether or not to go into a country, and in view of the big neighbor who might take revenge, knowing that we're going in and not going to be able to stay there forever, in the deliberations to decide to go ahead and go in there, knowing that the big neighbor's going to take revenge once we leave, can you spell out for us a little bit the deliberations that you guys go through?
Do you have a specific case in mind? Because I think each one is a little bit different. Do you have a specific? You're talking about country X and country Y. Do you have something in mind in particular?
Well, just our general policy, our general approach to knowing that when we leave,
right,
the big neighbor's going to take revenge.
It doesn't have to be the big neighbor. I mean, there's a famous saying by the Taliban talking about Afghanistan. They said, the Americans have the watches, but we have the time. They're not, it's like, we were talking about how many different countries today, and they say, the United States is, one of the reasons we're considered to be an exceptional country is because of our geography. We have generally friendly neighbors to the north and south and two big oceans between us, but today we have global interests. And so but we can always go home and become Fortress America if that's what we decide we want to do, and it promotes and advance American interests. So, but these other countries, just like I was talking about Turkey and Russia, they're not going to pick up and move away from one another. So they have to be thinking about that. And so I think that's part of the calculus is that then maybe the Americans are going home, and that's why countries hedge. And they start thinking about, well, if the Americans are going home, I better start thinking about this, or I better start thinking about that, or I better start snuggling up to the country X or country Y, or getting friendly, or opening diplomatic relations. That's how this game is played, I think. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think talking specifically to women in Iraq, this hit home to me. I think that we've made our job a lot harder by our lack of commitment. So that's a place where we did back out really soon. And I met women who'd gone to school, who'd taken strong political positions, and we bailed on them. We're just done. I met guys who translated for US troops. They were planning on coming here if Iraq failed, and it did. They're stuck there. And I think that what the effect has been, we say that we want, where's their commitment to their country? Why aren't they staying and fighting for it? Well, they've got a huge X on their backs. And by the way, they also know that those are backs that we don't have. So I think when we're talking about this geopolitically, how it affects everything, some of the refugees that are pouring out that are very deserving refugees, that are good refugees, are people who could have been instrumental in building thriving democracies and changing the future of their countries. But our lack of commitment, our lack of follow-through, when we know those authoritarian bad guys who have the long picture in mind are going to stick around and going to hold it out, I think we've just sent a horrible message to everybody that would be a reformer.
I'm very depressed by this panel. I don't know about you. We're going to the other side of the room now. This lady here.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Alexander from Castle Rock, Colorado. I'm trying to put together a few facts that have come from different parts of this conference. And Congressman Beaupre's question just a minute ago about how can Russia afford to do what they're doing spurs on my need to know this. In respect to the congressman from Montana, we all in this part of the state have loved coal. And one thing that has played into Obama's hands to diminish coal production is the low cost of natural gas. And as Mary pointed out during your session,
question please.
We now have the ability to liquefy natural gas, and we are now able to ship it to Europe. Peter, you said the reason they came through the Ukraine was to protect a port, which is partly true. But also the reason they came through the Ukraine was to protect that natural gas pipeline. When you brought that up, you just dismissed it. Isn't natural gas the hope that we can look forward to if we can sell natural gas to Europe, then Europe won't have to pay Putin all that money for the natural gas. That will lessen his ability to make money. But you guys all dismissed that.
So
I need
the
some
question
explanation.
is, will American natural gas exports be enough to take Putin's leverage away on the energy front?
I wouldn't say I'm an energy expert, but obviously it plays in the field of foreign policy and national security. I don't know if we can export enough of it. I mean, Europe is a lot of folks. There's in the European Union, there's more people in the United States, what, 400 or 500 million, right? So that's a lot of natural gas. And in fact, one of the great hopes initially was that Libya could provide for Europe. But I don't know that, I'm not a logistics guy, so maybe somebody else can answer that, but I don't know if we could provide enough to that. But I do agree in general with the principle that if you're not happy with somebody in a country that may oppose your interests, that I don't think it's a good idea to enrich them. So if you can find other ways to meet Europe's energy needs that would perhaps check Russia's ambitions, I support that.
No, 1 second. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But that's an interesting question. How do you remove the leverage that Putin has? If we can't do it through energy, how do we do it?
But I think it's important to remember, if Angela Merkel were here, she would say, this is all good, not bad, because we have to live with Russia. Russia, after all, has 1,900 thermonuclear weapons. We've got 0. We've reduced our army so much that if you take Germany, France, and England together, we don't even have 800 mainline battle tanks, and the Russians have thousands. So she would say, look, we are not the Germany of the past, and we atone for what we did before. But we understand we have to live with them, and maybe trade with them in non-military ways is one of the ways that we demonstrate that we are a peaceful Germany and Russia doesn't have to worry about us, which it did in World War I and World War II.
I don't think the United States, I may be wrong about this, but I don't think the United States has one permanently stationed tank in Europe today.
Wow.
Permanently stationed. They're on rotation.
Wow.
Wow.
I think that may still
We're
that
going
may not,
even
that may,
further
I just
south.
wanted to let that
Yeah.
conversation.
That was true at one point recently.
Yes, Julie. Isn't this a great panel? Almost 5 o'clock, and we've got so much to discuss. Jillian, yes.
So I think the energy is a really important facet. I mean, the United States has overtaken Russia as the top natural gas producer. We have overtaken Saudi Arabia. That's huge, and we should use it. There's a lot of environmental things that are holding back our doing it. We need to get on that. It's enormous. I think another resource that has been really untapped is Victor Davis Hanson talking about deterrence today. In a lot of places where there is chaos right now, we do have good allies. I mean, if you look at some of the Kurds, I keep in touch with one Peshmerga guy. He's Facebooking me. He's going out and fighting ISIS every day. This is a guy who's Muslim, willing to die to protect his country's freedom. Incredible. In Ukraine, I met this woman. She was 19 years old, red hair, looks like an Urban Outfitters model. During the Maidan Revolution, she was making Molotov cocktails to protect the protesters. Not because she had bloodlust, but because she understood what it was to fight for your country, to fight for your freedoms. And she craved democracy. I mean, I was so inspired there by listening to young Ukrainians, listening to how they expressed their desire for liberty, their desire for the same principles that built the United States. And I think we're really overlooking that they are an incredible resource. We need to be investing in these people. We need to be propping up our allies. We need to be making firm commitments to them, because ultimately they are going to be the ones that are waiting there. And there are some great people out there who are willing to fight those fights if we just help them out a little.
Jennifer, do I have time for one more question? Excellent. The lady with the mic in the back.
Yes, thank you. Harriet Hageman from Cheyenne, Wyoming. I've been listening to this all day, and we have learned quite a bit of information. Everyone here has. My question is how could one person being in office for 7 years in the United States could have created this kind of chaos that we are seeing around the world?
How did this happen? Peter?
Oh. I would change the question around a little bit. I think that people are taking advantage of Americans or the Obama doctrine, which is a non-confrontational sort of doctrine, one that believes prays at the altar of diplomacy. And I'm not saying diplomacy is important. I mean, we use it in our daily lives. It's an important part of human nature. An administration that believes if we're nice to them, they'll be nice to us. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's
Professor,
fair.
do you agree?
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
please.
No. What I was going to say, I think this is postmodernism, basically, which we see on academic campuses all the time. And it's a belief that the United States isn't necessarily a good country, that often it's done terrible things. You saw that when they had to change about Muslims, and they went back to what Christians had done only 800 years ago or 900 years ago. So I think part of the problem we have here, outside of his total lack of experience or real knowledge, outside of being from 7 to 11 in Indonesia, but that was meant humorously. But we all go there at that age. But I think what's powerful here is that this resonates, unfortunately, with a serious part of the American population. And I see that all the time, which is that because I teach graduate students and undergraduates at DU, their knowledge of history, their knowledge of a lot of the things that we're talking about is minimal. And to them, they wouldn't call it neo-isolationism, but it would amount to, basically, we shouldn't intervene unless there's some overwhelming threat, without getting into all of these details, because they know very little about that. One time I was doing a 2-day course about Russia, and the first thing I asked this group was, so what do you know about Russia? They said nothing. And so we're very fortunate to have had this panel today.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I think, unfortunately,
I also think that the president wasn't that interested in these issues when he came into office.
Right.
And when you are in office for 7 years, you get dealt a hand of cards, and you have to play them. And it is incumbent upon the commander-in-chief and the president, chief executive, and chief diplomat to promote and advance American interests. And I think that largely that they have, on many accounts, they have failed. So these are things that happened. These are things that international players reacted to in terms of this president. And
Well,
I think
interest is such a key word. I think so much of the diplomacy has been built around, nice gestures or a collective security where we just assume that everyone shares the same interest in, for example, protecting Ukraine that Ukrainians do. That's not true. Our foreign policy has succeeded best when it's operated on a balance of power system built around shared interests. And optimism about human nature that blinds us to forging relationships based on shared interests has not panned out.
But there's one person who loves what Obama's done, and you can be sure that Vladimir Putin in his succeeding 10 years will build an 8-foot-high statue of President
Wonderful.
Obama and put it in the Kremlin, so we can
Wonderful.
remember the good old days.
Excellent. Thank you very much to the panel. Please join me in thanking them.
Do you have a card?
probably do. Let's see.